Okay, children. Do you want to hear about my youth in Timbuktu?
Yeah!
Timbuktu is the intellectual and spiritual capital and the center for propagation of Islam throughout Africa. It is located where the Niger flows northward into the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. As a result, Timbuktu has been a natural meeting point of the Songhai, Wangara, Fulani, and Tuareg and Arabs. It is through this magical city that I was able to meet Berbers, Arabs, Jews from the Middle East, Moroccans, and so many other groups that I interacted with during my heyday.
I was part of the Tuareg tribe, an Islamic Berber semi-nomadic group in northern West Africa. Long before, we were converted to Islam during the Umayyad dynasty, and our religion eventually became very influential in the fate of Timbuktu. When I was just 100 years old in 1100 CE, we created the city of Timbuktu, and eventually it flourished into a great trade post of the trans-Saharan caravan routes. People from all across the sand roads met in Timbuktu to share goods and ideas.
Grandpa, how old are you?
Hush, hush, just listen to the story.
In the early 14th century, the city was conquered by Mali. One of our greatest kings during our time in the Mali Empire was Mansa Musa, who made a famous pilgrimage to Mecca and built a famous mosque called Jingari Bear, or more commonly known as the Great Mosque. Mansa Musa, who I was able to meet multiple times at the open-air market, helped expose the wealth of Timbuktu to the rest of the world. He really put us on the map. Our time in the Mali Empire was interesting, but the peak of the city occurred when it was under control of the Songhai Empire.
When did the Songhai conquer Timbuktu?
For a brief period of time, the Tuareg reconquered the city, but it was in 1468 that the Songhai ruler Sani Ali took over the city. Although he was unenthusiastic about scholarship, his successors supported and sponsored learning and scholarship in the city, creating a golden age of Islamic culture, of which I was a part. During this golden age, there were many different madrasas, the most famous one being Sankor University. Not an Ivy League, but still a great school. You guys should consider it. Anyways, Sankor contained thousands of manuscripts written in Arabic.
Sadly, this golden age did not last forever. I remember the day in 1591 when the Moroccans came in after the fall of my favorite empire, the Songhai Empire. Invaders came and looted the city and enslaved scholars and tried to steal the archives. My precious city was defiled. Timbuktu declined and was never again as prosperous and important as it was in the post-classical era, as it had lost a lot of its wealth from being looted, and its deterioration made it an easy target for those vile invaders. At one point, it was taken over by the French, who attempted to restore the city, to no avail. Today, it is an administrative center of the modern Republic of Mali, but its cultural and economic importance are a shadow of what they once were.
Grandpa, you let the French take over? How could you?
I know. It was a very sad time for me. But you probably don't want to hear about all this history. Do you want to know about my life there?
Yeah!
Well, I was a devout Muslim, as most other people were in Timbuktu. Every day, 5 times a day, the mosque would call us to prayer, and I would stop what I was doing to pray to Allah. Sometimes I would even pray at the Great Mosque.
Well, we know that, Grandpa, but why was Timbuktu so important to Islam?
Well, Tim, Timbuktu was one of the greatest centers of Islamic thought and theological scholarship in all of Afro-Eurasia, and certainly the most important in West Africa. It is now estimated that at the city's height, Timbuktu had as many as 25,000 students, making up a whole quarter of its population. There were 3 hugely significant mosques in the city. Jengure Bur was the mosque that Mansa Musa built after returning from Mecca. There was also a Sidi Yahya, which was built in the mid-1500s. However, the most important mosque was the Sankor Madrasa. That was the mosque that was the center of scholarship in Timbuktu. This mosque also served as a university. I and all my friends were students there.
Awesome! I didn't know you were so important!
I really wasn't, Tutu. As I said, there were many, many scholars. I was just one of thousands. Anyways, the Sankor Madrasa was home to thousands of religious and scholarly texts, even more than I could get through during my time there. Many of my fellow scholars become very important and influential in worldwide Islamic thought. And Timbuktu was a large facilitator of the spread of Islam and Arabic culture throughout the West and North Africa.
But what about the economic importance? Was there trade in Timbuktu?
There sure was, Bucky.
In the early days of the city, it was a very important trading post for the trans-Saharan gold salt trade. Berber nomads from the north brought salt from the Mediterranean, and traders from all over West Africa brought gold. I met many interesting people from all over the Eurasian world. They all met up in Timbuktu to trade. As time went on, the trade in Timbuktu became more diversified, and goods from all over the Eurasian continent showed up in Timbuktu. In its height, the city was extremely rich from all its trade. This influx of diverse ideas contributed to a rich scholarly culture in Timbuktu. People studied philosophy, science, and religion in beautiful libraries and madrasas often built by the kings. Merchants also liked being in Timbuktu, as it was a good place for them to rest on their travels.
Wait, Grandpa, don't science and religion contradict each other?
You may think this would be the case, but it wasn't. People saw science as a way to understand Allah's creation and come closer to understanding the divine. It was not seen as a challenge to faith, but rather an exploration and celebration of it. Because of this, scholars flocked to Timbuktu to study and worship. This kind of ingenuity and thinking is part of what made Timbuktu such a unique place to be living.
But women were so often persecuted during the post-classical era. I'm sure they were excluded from all of this greatness.
You're right, Tutu. Things weren't so equal between men and women, mostly because of the spread of Islam and Arabic culture. But because of the West African culture of Timbuktu, it was more progressive in gender equality than many other important cities at this time.
West African tradition was much more relaxed about female and male interaction than Islamic law in other regions. Timbuktu was a very interesting city because it represented the Islamization of Africa and the Africanization of Islam. Women in Timbuktu were allowed to walk around almost naked.
Naked?
Yes, it was very hot though. We were in the Sahara. We didn't have air conditioning back then. You can't blame them. Anyways, women were allowed to be nearly naked and weren't required to cover themselves or even their hair, like Islamic law states. Married women were allowed to talk to and interact with men who weren't in their families. One time, when I was busy studying in the madrasa, a shouting Arabic man came running through, furious about how free the women were. We were also shocked that he wanted to force women out of the city and make them to cover up and stay at home. His name is Ibn Battuta, and he claimed to be some famous traveler, but I think he was just suffering from heat exhaustion.
Were women allowed to study the Quran and become scholars?
No, and I admit we were mistaken in that. Women were technically not supposed to own books, be in the madrasas, or take part in the scholar culture. However, some elite women were taught to read. Life for women was surely better than in many other cities, but it wasn't perfect. In this situation, the Islamization of Africa won out over the Africanization of Islam. Most of the slaves in Timbuktu were women, who were forced to do housework, and some were bought as concubines.
There were slaves?
Yes, there were quite a few, in fact.
Along with the other exchanges going on in Timbuktu was the slave trade. The slave trade was in fact one of the most significant commercial activities of the region. As I said before, most of the slaves in West Africa were foreign women who served as domestic servants or concubines, but there were also slaves traded in our region that went to work as soldiers or took part in heavy labor. We sold off many West Africans to be slaves outside of West Africa, but most of our own slaves came from foreign regions. There was a bit of a moral issue with our dependency on slavery, because Islamic law tells us that it is wrong to enslave any fellow Muslims. So oftentimes, our foreign slaves figured this out and converted or pretended to convert to Islam. Many owners were reluctant to free their slaves because they'd have to pay for more. My good friend Ahmed Baba wrote about this issue and decided that if you test a slave after they convert and they prove themselves to be true Muslims, you had to set them free.
Life for slaves was very bad. At certain times, slaves were just about the same price as books, so you can tell from that just how undervalued these people's lives were.
Were there peasants in Timbuktu?
There were a few, but while I was there, I don't really remember seeing any. The cities in West Africa were centers for the elites. Many elites converted to Islam in order to facilitate trade with the growing number of Islamic merchants, widening the cultural gap between peasants and elites. Most of the inhabitants were soldiers, scholars, merchants, or those serving the king. Most peasants lived outside the city in the fields, and other than trading their food in the marketplace, they didn't have much of a place in Timbuktu. All I really know about the peasants is that they didn't convert to Islam, and so were really left out altogether from elite culture.
Anyways, it's your bedtime now. Story time is over.
Aww.
It's alright. Come along, children.